March 12, 1945, Guam, Mariana Islands. The air hangs thick with salt and ash. Dawn breaks over the western edge of the island, and the jungle still smoulders from artillery fire that ceased only hours before. Along a muddy ridge overlooking the ocean, a column of Japanese soldiers moves in silence, their rifles gone, their hands empty, their eyes fixed on the torn earth beneath their feet. They are prisoners now. The word itself is foreign, forbidden. In the doctrine they carried into battle, surrender was erasure. Death was honorable. Captivity was not a possibility the Empire prepared them for. They are marched past burned-out pillboxes and shallow graves, past the twisted wreckage of supply trucks and the skeletal remains of palm trees. The Americans who escort them do not shout. They do not strike. They walk with rifles slung low, chewing gum, their uniforms still stained with the mud of yesterday's advance. To the Japanese prisoners, this is the first shock, not cruelty, but indifference. They had been told the Americans were soft, decadent, a nation of merchants and moviegoers who would buckle under the weight of real war. They had been told that surrender to such an enemy meant humiliation, torture, death. But the Americans do not look at them with hatred. They look at them the way one might look at a problem that needs solving. The prisoners are led to a clearing near the coast, a stretch of flattened ground where the jungle has been bulldozed back, and the coral dust rises in white clouds with every step. There is nothing here, no shelter, no walls, no wire, just open space and the distant sound of machinery grinding somewhere beyond the tree line. The prisoners are told to sit. They do, and they wait, expecting what men have always expected in war: rations withheld, orders barked, the slow degradation of captivity. They have seen it themselves in China, in the Philippines, in every territory the empire claimed. Prisoners are burdens, prisoners are expendable. But that is not what happens. What the Japanese soldiers did not understand, what they could not have understood, was that the American military had spent 3 years preparing for this exact moment. Not just the capture of enemy soldiers, but the logistics of managing them. The United States had signed the Geneva Convention. Its commanders had studied the failures of the First World War, when prisoners died by the thousands from neglect and disease. The Pentagon had created entire manuals on the treatment of POWs, detailed down to caloric intake, shelter standards, medical care, and recreational access. This was not charity, this was doctrine, and behind that doctrine was an infrastructure unmatched in human history. By the spring of 1945, the United States was producing more food, more steel, more fuel, more medicine than the rest of the world combined. Its factories ran in 3 shifts. Its supply chains stretched across 2 oceans. Its logistics corps could drop a field, hospital into the jungle and have it operational within 12 hours. The machinery of American abundance did not pause for sentiment or ideology. It simply moved. And now, on a muddy ridge on Guam, that machinery was about to reveal itself. The first trucks arrive just after noon. They come in a line, heavy and loud, their tires chewing through the soft ground. The prisoners watch in silence as crates are unloaded, wooden boxes stamped with stenciled letters, canvas tarps bundled and tied, steel poles stacked like firewood. American engineers step down from the trucks, young men in sweat-soaked fatigues, and they do not look at the prisoners. They look at the ground. One of them pulls out a folded map, spreads it across the hood of a jeep, and begins marking coordinates. Another drives stakes into the earth with a sledgehammer. The sound echoes across the clearing, metal striking coral, sharp and rhythmic, a drumbeat of construction. Within 30 minutes, the first tent goes up, then another, then 10 more. The prisoners sit and watch as the Americans work with a speed that seems almost mechanical. There is no hesitation, no confusion. Every man knows his task. Poles are driven, ropes are lashed, canvas is stretched taut and tied down. A field kitchen is assembled from pieces, steel frames, fuel canisters, iron stoves that are bolted together like toys. Water tanks are rolled off the trucks and connected to rubber hoses. Generators are started, their engines coughing to life, and suddenly there are lights strung between poles, bulbs glowing faintly in the afternoon haze. One prisoner, a former sergeant from Hiroshima, later wrote in his diary, "They built a city while we sat in the dirt. It was not possible. We had been taught that Americans were lazy, that they needed machines because they were weak. But I watched them lift steel beams without cranes. I watched them dig latrines in ground so hard our shovels would have broken. They did not look weak." By dusk, the camp is complete. Rows of tents stand in perfect alignment, their entrances facing east. A mess hall has been erected, open-sided and roofed, with long tables and benches cut from fresh timber. A medical station occupies the northernmost corner, marked by a red cross painted on canvas. Latrines have been dug and lined with lime. A perimeter fence of barbed wire is strung on posts, not to cage the prisoners, but to mark the boundary of the American zone. And at the center of it all, a flagpole rises, bare for now, waiting. The prisoners are called forward. They stand and move slowly, their legs stiff, their faces blank. They are directed to the mess hall where American cooks are already working, steel pots steaming, ladles clanging, the smell of cooked meat drifting through the humid air. The prisoners are handed tin trays, they are handed forks, they are told to line up. And then they are served. The meal is not elaborate. Canned beef, boiled rice, bread, canned peaches in syrup. But it is hot. It is clean. It is more food than many of the prisoners have seen in weeks. Some of them stare at their trays as if the contents might vanish. Others eat slowly, mechanically, their hands shaking. A few cannot eat at all. They sit with full trays and weep. This is the second shock, not the labor, not the efficiency, but the food. In the Imperial Japanese Army, rations had been scarce for over a year. Soldiers ate rice mixed with grass. They boiled leather belts for protein. They watched their comrades die not from bullets, but from beriberi and starvation. And now, as prisoners, they are fed, not scraps, not leftovers, but rations identical to what the American soldiers eat. One prisoner, a corporal named Takashi Yamada, later testified to American interrogators, "I did not believe it was real. I thought it was a trick, that the food was poisoned, or that they would take it away, but they did not. They gave us more. When we asked, I had been told that Americans hated us, that they would make us suffer, but they did not hate us. They did not care enough to hate us. We were just another problem they solved." That night, the prisoners are assigned to tents, 12 men per shelter, with cots and blankets distributed evenly. Some of them lie down and sleep immediately, their bodies surrendering to exhaustion. Others sit awake, staring at the canvas walls, trying to reconcile what they have seen with everything they were taught. The Empire had told them that the West was decadent, that democracy made men selfish and weak, that only through discipline and sacrifice could a nation achieve greatness. But here, in a camp built in a single afternoon, they had witnessed something that did not fit the narrative. The Americans were not weak. They were overwhelmingly, terrifyingly strong, and their strength did not come from suffering. It came from abundance. The United States Army's logistics doctrine in the Pacific Theater was built on a principle called overwhelming supply. The idea was simple: deliver more than you need, faster than you need it, and ensure that no unit ever ran short. But in 1945, the American supply chain stretched across 10,000 miles of ocean, from the factories of Detroit to the beaches of Okinawa. Liberty ships carried tanks and trucks, refrigerated vessels carried meat and milk, hospital ships carried plasma and antibiotics, and behind it all was an economy that had transformed itself entirely for war. In 1940, the United States produced 4,000 aircraft. In 1944, it produced 96,000. It built more ships in 4 years than Japan had built in a century. It trained more pilots, manufactured more bullets, refined more fuel, and fed more soldiers than any nation in history. And crucially, it did so without sacrificing the living standards of its civilians. American families still ate meat, they still drove cars, they still went to movies. The war did not starve the homeland, it enriched it. For the Japanese prisoners on Guam, this was incomprehensible. Their own nation had stripped itself bare for the war effort. Civilians ate sweet potatoes and rationed rice. Factories melted down temple bells for metal. Boys were conscripted at 15. The entire society had been mobilized, and still, it was not enough. Japan's supply lines were broken, its navy was sunk, its cities were ash. And yet here, on a captured island halfway across the Pacific, the Americans had built a functioning camp in a single day, complete with food, shelter, medicine, and electricity. One officer, Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, later wrote in his memoir, "We were told that America was rich but weak, that they had things but no spirit. I believed this until I saw them work. They did not work like slaves, they did not work like fanatics, they worked like men who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it 100 times before. That was more frightening than any battle, because it meant they could do this anywhere, anytime, forever." In the days that followed, the camp expanded. More prisoners arrived from other parts of the island, men who had been hiding in caves, men who had tried to resist and been captured, men who had simply walked out of the jungle with their hands raised. The Americans processed them all with the same methodical efficiency. Names were recorded, wounds were treated, interrogations were conducted not with torture but with translators and typewriters. The prisoners were given tasks, digging drainage ditches, cleaning latrines, sorting supplies. They were paid in scrip. They were allowed to write letters home, though most did not. Some did not believe their families still existed. And every evening at sunset, the American flag was raised on the pole at the center of camp. The prisoners were not required to watch, but many did. They stood outside their tents and stared at the fabric as it climbed the pole, red and white and blue against the fading light. Some of them had seen that flag before, on ships, on tanks, on the shoulders of dead Marines. But now they saw it differently. It was not just a symbol of the enemy, it was a symbol of a system that built camps overnight, a system that fed its prisoners, a system that did not collapse under the weight of its own logistics. One prisoner, in a letter later found among his belongings, wrote, "I do not know if we were right or wrong to fight, but I know now that we could not have won, not because the Americans were braver, not because they hated us more, but because they had so much food, so much metal, so much fuel, and they did not run out, they never ran out." By war's end, over 40,000 Japanese soldiers had been taken prisoner by American forces in the Pacific. Almost all of them survived captivity. They were housed, fed, and treated according to international law. Some worked in labor details. Some attended classes on democracy. Some simply waited for the war to end, sitting in tents on islands. They had once tried to conquer, watching the Americans build roads and airstrips and harbors with the same terrifying efficiency they had used to build the camps. When the prisoners were finally repatriated to Japan in 1946, they returned to a country that no longer existed. The empire had surrendered. The emperor had renounced his divinity. The cities were rubble, and the Americans had arrived not as conquerors, but as rebuilders. The same logistics that had supplied the war machine now supplied the peace. Food shipments poured into Japanese ports. Engineers rebuilt bridges, doctors vaccinated children. The machinery of American abundance, which had once been turned toward destruction, was now turned toward reconstruction. Many of the former prisoners struggled to reconcile what they had experienced. They had been taught that surrender was death, that captivity meant suffering, that the Americans were soft and decadent. But they had seen the truth. The Americans were not soft, they were simply operating on a scale that the Empire had never imagined. And that scale was not built on cruelty or ideology. It was built on production, on logistics, on the simple, overwhelming capacity to deliver more than anyone else. One former prisoner, decades later, said in an interview, "I learned in that camp that strength is not about suffering. It is not about how much pain you can endure. It is about how much you can build, and America could build anything." The camp on Guam no longer exists. The tents were dismantled, the poles were pulled up, the jungle reclaimed the clearing, and the coral dust settled back into the earth. But the memory of that place, of what it represented, endured. It was a microcosm of a larger truth, a truth that the Axis powers had failed to understand until it was too late. Democracy, for all its inefficiencies and contradictions, had proven capable of mobilizing resources on an unimaginable scale, not through terror, not through sacrifice, but through systems, through organization, through the belief that abundance, not scarcity, was the foundation of power. The Japanese prisoners who watched that camp rise in a single afternoon carried that lesson home. Some rejected it, some embraced it, but none of them forgot it. They had called the Americans weak. They had believed their own propaganda. And then they had watched in silence as the machinery of a free nation built a city in the dirt and fed them while their own empire starved. That is the paradox of strength. It is not always loud. It is not always violent. Sometimes it is simply a tent rising from the ground, a meal served on a tin tray, a flag lifting into the wind. And sometimes that is enough to break an ideology.